All right, so we are still talking about things related to ABAP objects, and last time we were together, we left off in this vicinity right here, talking about how we actually call methods in an object that we have created. And what we see here is an example of where we make reference to the object and then use an arrowhead with the name of the method with open parentheses. What kind of method do we know we are calling in this instance? This is a functional method. We know that to be the case because we're not passing it any parameters. Well, we don't necessarily know it is a functional method because we don't know if it's returning anything. But if we put that on the right side of an equal sign, for example, then we would know that to be true. We observe can't be a space. We have to be very careful with spacing when it relates to method calls here. This would clearly be an example of a functional method because we're only passing one parameter. And remember our rule of thumb, very specific here. The only time we can call methods like this in ABAP is when we have only one parameter and it's an importing parameter. And when we have that situation, we can just list the name of the data that we want to pass the method in the parentheses and have that be the end of it. But if we have anything more complex than that scenario, then what we have to resort to is specifying these parameter value pairs inside of the method call, where the idea here is we don't see the word importing, exporting, or changing inside of the parentheses, so we know these are all importing parameters in terms of the method itself. And so we list the parameter name and then the data to be passed.
Does that designate a functional method as well?
We don't know.
Okay.
Because we don't know if returning is employed here. We can't tell just given that small burst of code.
Functional method on the two above? Only if it's on the right side?
Only if it's on the right side of an equal sign or it's in a similar place contextually. Are we all good? All right, and so where we left off last time was talking about the scenario where we have more than one kind of parameter passing. And remember, the potentially tricky part of this is that what we use in the definition of the method as far as the mechanism for parameter passing, whether it's importing, exporting, or changing, gets flipped, at least for exporting and importing in the call, because of the idea that if the caller is sending the data, the receiver is catching it and vice versa. So this takes a little bit of getting used to, but I don't think it's necessarily that complex. We still are using parameter name and value name here in the pairs, no comma between them. And now, though, we've had to add exporting, importing, and changing as needed. So this is, I think, where we, for the most part, left off last time. Here's a more particular reference to functional methods. There are a couple different ways that we could handle the return value of a functional method. The value to be returned by the method can be listed as receiving. And there we would list the parameter name once again, and then the data value to be received back. This is one way that we could do this, but the more typical way, and what I would suggest that you just plan on doing, would be this right here. Notice what I've done is I've gotten rid of the receiving clause, and I have just put in where I was going to store the result anyhow, which is data 4. It now shows up on the left side of the equal sign, and since I only have one parameter, and from the method's perspective it is of type importing, I can call it using the fashion that we discussed a moment ago. So you will get opportunity to practice with all of this in your homework, but I provided this chart that we looked at last time just by way of clarification. So from the method's perspective, when you write the method, if you say a parameter is importing, when you call it and the caller use listed as exporting, if it's exporting in the method definition, it's importing for the sake of the method call. Changing is always changing. And then don't ask me why they did this, but returning and receiving are the keywords that are used in the event of a functional method. Questions? I'd be hard pressed to give you one where that would apply. I think it would always just be at your discretion to do that.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So you have the class definition and implementation. So the definition is where we'd be obviously doing the method definitions of import and exporting.
Mm-hmm.
The implementation is just where the executable code goes as well. And then after start selection is when we start doing all of the method calls where we infer some of those from import to export.
Yep. Yeah, so, and I think as you think about workflow of writing a program, if you start by writing your class and all the pieces of the class, so you'd be working from the left side of this right here. It's very easy to think in terms of, okay, I'm the method, what am I taking in, what am I sending back? It becomes very easy. Then when you write the other part of the program, the procedural part, you just kind of have to put on a different hat and think, okay, I'm the caller now, not the receiver. Where it gets challenging is where you're bouncing back and forth writing code for the method and then for the procedural code, then the method procedural code. Then you really have to stop yourself and think very carefully about it. But although it's different, I don't think that it's inherently super confusing. I think in a way it adds more clarity to your code. So just something to get used to when doing ABAP development. All right, so here's the new piece we are adding today, constructor. A class may define a constructor method. If it does, the name of that method by definition must be constructor. A constructor method must be public, and a constructor method can only have importing parameters. Now, it may not have any parameters, but if it does have parameters, they can only be importing. But keep in mind, that does mean the things that we have talked about previously, where there could be default values specified for these parameters, or they could just be designated as optional. The constructor is not called explicitly, but the constructor method is called implicitly when we create a new object. So this is very parallel to what I'm sure you have seen in other programming languages. So why do we need a constructor? Well, constructors are useful. What we will use it a lot for is initializing attributes for an object. So when we create a particular object, we need to set things up, maybe set default values for the attributes, or in other ways do some setting up of things. The constructor gives us the ability to do that. Allocating resources for the object. Hypothetically, we might need to go out and query a database. We might need to pull in information. The constructor can do that for us. Or maybe even triggering other activities that need to happen when a new object is created. All of that happens within the context of the constructor. So let's go back to the class we have been creating here, which is the vehicle class. And we have not put in a constructor to this point. And so let's do that. So we will add a new method. So I'll just come here to the very top of our method list and do a methods constructor. And I do want to employ parameter passing here, but let me talk you through the logic here. I want the user when he or she calls this constructor implicitly. In other words, when the user creates one of these objects, I want the user to be able to set the object up. Meaning I want the user to be able to give a name to the driver, if they so choose, give an age to the driver, give a gender, give a year's driving, give a color to the car, give a wheels to the car, give gas, give data, give gas consumed, to give miles traveled. I want the user to be able to initialize all of those attributes. And in fact, I think we have another attribute hiding down here at the bottom, MPG, that we'd forgotten about perhaps in some of our previous discussions. So I want all of this to be able to be set up here. So my call here looks a lot like other things that we have done previously, and then I'll have the keyword here, importing, and then the value that I want to import. So let's just say, for example, name. And actually, I'm going to make my life a little bit easier here, and I'm going to do some copying of code we've already written, and then just change it up a little bit. You know, I have this set driver method here, so I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to say, okay, for my constructor, I want to be able to import a name, but there's a default value for that. And age, what I'm going to do here, for reasons that you'll see, I'm going to specify default values of everything here. So the age will default to 18, gender type C will default to, and let's assume that in the logic of our program we use M for male, F for female, and U for unknown. So I'll just put U for unknown here. And years driving will default to 1. You know, I don't know that I can give you a compelling argument for that, but we keep going here. Now we have color, which is of type, me and the caps lock key aren't getting along here, type string, default, unknown, gas, type P, default, and this is supposed to be, I think, the amount of gas in the tank, so we'll default that to 0. Gas consumed, type P, default 0. Miles traveled, type P, default 0. And then there was that one at the bottom, MPG type, I think that was probably type P. No, I think we did I for that, type I, default 0. Okay, so this is now my constructor. Now notice I can get away with passing no parameters to this constructor at all, because every parameter that is there has a default value associated with it. So this would be pretty typical logic. The nice thing about this is, in other programming languages, in the guts of the constructor, I might have to employ logic to figure out values that I have been passed. Or even in some other programs, what I might have to do, other programming languages, bless you, I might have to write multiple constructors for if the user passes me this, or if the user passes me this, or something else. But in ABAP, this becomes now very, very easy. And I'm going to cheat a little bit here. I'm going to copy this, bless you. And I'm going to come down here now to my implementation section. And I'm going to add the definition for this method. So I have to change this to the keyword method. And then I have to employ disambiguation here, but my code will be relatively straightforward. This will be me, name, don't know where the I came from there, me, name, equals name. And all the rest of my lines of code are going to look the exact same as that. Now, while I am typing that, someone explained to me the logic that's going on here. Why is this all that I need in this situation? Let me revise the question. Will I always write my method, my constructor method, to look like this? Explain what's going on to me in this code right here.
Variables and parameters have the same names, so you use self-references.
Okay. All right, but beyond that's what the syntax of the code is. Logically, what am I doing here?
Setting all the attributes for the class.
Okay, and I'm setting them to what?
The default value.
Am I setting them to the default values?
Or the constructors set values.
Explain that in more detail, because you might be right, but I'm not sure.
You're either setting the default for what gets passed to the constructor from the call.
From the definition to the implementation.
All right, so there are potentially, this code is kind of mind-numbing to write, but the logic here is actually pretty significant, because here's what's going to happen. Essentially, the way line 70 is going to play out is like this. Line 70 is going to say, okay, I am supposed to set the attribute name to a value. And I will either set it to name unknown, because that's the default value, or if the user has given me a value, I will use that value. So every one of these lines that I'm writing here has that inherent logic to it, where I'm either going to be setting it to a default value, or I'm going to be setting it to what the user has passed me. And the merit of writing the code the way that I have done here is I don't have to write any conditional code. Everything here is inherently conditional based on having defined a default value for the parameter. That's critical to understand. So I want to make sure that you do, in fact, understand what's going on here. Everybody get this? Yes, sir.
Since we have a driver type, shouldn't we really be initiating that in this constructor? Because it's like a sub-object within the class. Is that accurate?
Okay, so let's talk about that for a second, because that is a really good question. And the answer to that is we could employ the structure. But let's talk about what would happen if we employed the structure. What I would have to do here is I could not do, and I think the name of the structure is driver. I could not do me arrowhead driver equals driver. Why could I not do that?
We haven't created an object first of all.
I have created an object. That happened in the line of code I haven't showed you, but happened before this. There's something we seem to be forgetting. If I have structure 1 and structure 2 that have been defined in my program, can I do str1 equals str2? I can't do that. That's not valid code. So I couldn't write my code this way. So I would have to revise this to be reflective of the fact that I'm doing a structure copy as opposed to a singular data type. The other thing then becomes challenging is, if I do write my code to allow the entire structure, the way my code is written now, I could allow the user to give a name for the driver, but they don't have to specify the gender. If I did the structure, it would be all or nothing. They would have to give me all the pieces, in which case I would use them, and I would lose the ability to have default values here. Now, I could write the code that way. That might be what I would need in a particular situation. But this allows me to allow the caller to truly have great flexibility as to which of these values they supply and which of them they don't. Okay? And we'll see that as we play around with this a little bit more. So let me save and do a code check on this to make sure we're good. And field name is unknown. What is the name of my field? Oh, well, what you did ask was a really good thing. My parameter here is driver, so this should actually be, and maybe this is what you were asking me a moment ago. This should be driver dash name equals name, and then age, and then I think the driver also has gender in it. And the driver has years driving. All right. So now what I need to show you is the code for the constructor. So we've talked about before, when I want to create an object, I have a start selection statement, and then I have a data statement where I actually create a reference data object to the object that is going to be created. So data object name, type ref2 class name, and now here is where our code gets a little bit different. Create object, and then the name of the object, and then I follow that with an exporting statement, and then values for whatever parameters I want to pass it. Notice in nowhere here are there any parentheses employed. So let's go back and look at our code to this point. I have in fact created an object. I did so on lines 128 and 129. So here's the question I have for you. If I tried to run this program right now without modifying it in any way, would my program run, and would it run validly? I have one person saying yes and a bunch of people not answering at all, okay? Those of you that say yes, or those of you that did not answer but know the answer to be yes, explain to me why I don't have to modify any of my code at this point. I have made every one of the parameters going into my constructor as inherently optional, because every one of them has a default value. So what I am using here in this program right now is what is commonly called the default constructor. It's the constructor that gets called when the user doesn't pass anything, okay? Now, let's take out some of our code here. I think say hi was a silly method we wrote that just prints hi to the screen. So I'm going to get rid of the call to say hi. And I'm going to get rid of this explicit call to set the number of wheels, because I think we had a default parameter now for that. And I'm going to get rid of this setting of the color. And I'm going to get rid of all of this stuff right here related to setting the driver manually like we were doing before. And here I create a couple of data objects, driver age, driver gender, and I make a call to get driver info, and then I write out things to the screen. So let's see if in fact this does work and if it produces the response we were looking for here. And so Bob Driverton execute. And now, why did I get name unknown 18 and you? Well, I got that because I asked the user for the name of the user, but I didn't actually use it. I just created the object here based on the default value. Now, here's something that we talked about before in a different context, but let's look at this just to prove to ourselves that this program is doing what we want. I'm going to employ the debugger here. And so I'll run the program. Doesn't matter what I type in here, so I'm just going to type in garbage, execute, and now we're going to shell out to the debugger. And what I want us to look at is the object. So I have an object here called my sports car. And if I look at my sports car in detail, here's what we see here. Miles per gallon is 0. Driver is a deep structure. Color unknown, wheels 0, gas consuming. So everything's been zeroed out here. The reason why it says driver is a deep structure is because, remember, that's a structure. So let's see if I can drill in on this and find out what's there. Yeah, the name's been set to name unknown, the age is 18, the gender is you, and the years driving is 1. So all of my default values have in fact been employed here just the way I expected them to. So let's go back though and talk about if I wanted to supply values here, okay? So now I can make a call here, and in create object, instead of having a period there, I can say exporting, and I can say I want the user's name to be set equal to Robert Jones, and I could say that I want the driver's, I think, age set equal to 97, and years driving equals, he started driving really young, 88. And I don't actually need the quotes there, around 97. So notice essentially what I've been able to do is I can just pick which of the values that I want to set and which of them aren't really important to me. And I'll employ the debugger again to allow us to take a look at this. And so when we execute this, still not using this, even though it's still in the program. So let's look at my sports car, and we'll see driver, Robert Jones, age 97, years driving 88. So the values that I wanted set have been set. Everything else is just at the default values, okay? Now, let me ask you a question. As it stands now, things like gas and gas consumed and miles traveled and MPG, they're all being set to 0 here. I mean, you see default values 0, 0, 0, 0. We know from our experience in programming that most programming languages, and ABAP included, will automatically initialize numeric variables to 0. So couldn't I just get rid of the default 0, knowing that what's going to happen here is it's going to be initialized to 0? Could I do that? All right, so you've raised an interesting point, which is, and we'll just play around with miles per gallon, okay? So you've made the observation, I could change this to optional, and I absolutely could change that to optional. But now, let me ask you, do I need to rewrite anything in my method definition? See, the reason why this right here worked was because I had a default value for MPG. If you want to make MPG optional, now I've got to check to see if it has been set to a value. So we talked about the code for that previously, and let's see if we have it here, is not initial. So now I would have to do if MPG is not initial, that right there. So it's kind of your choice. You could do what I did with saying a default value of 0, in which case I wrote one line of code. Or you could say that the parameter is optional, in which case you're going to have to come here to check to see if the user did in fact specify a value for that parameter, and if so, use it. Now, here's where this gets even more fun. Let's suppose that instead of having up here before default 0, I had default 1, and I wanted the miles per gallon to have a default value of 1, but I wanted to still use optional. I could still do that, but now I've got to come down here and I've got to say if miles per gallon is not initial, then this, else me MPG equals 1. Or I could just specify default value. So the point I'm trying to make here is default values are your friend, because they can really keep you from having to write a lot of code, particularly in the domain of a constructor. And what is very, very powerful about this and very easy about this in ABAP is we have written a method here, and I'm going to put my code back to the way it was a moment ago. We have written a method here that inherently the user can call any number of different ways based on whatever values they want to pass or they elect not to pass based upon the context of their particular program. Questions?
That's how it handles all overloading. You wouldn't need to ever create multiple constructors for the same.
That's absolutely correct. One method, and it's overloaded in, it's not infinite, but a huge number of different ways here are possible now to call this with one method definition. The key here obviously is having good default values or reasonable default values in the context of your program. Yes, sir?
Can you have multiple constructor methods?
No. One. Other questions? All right, let us look at your